Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. We're going to get back to the most consequential American who ever lived, and that is George Washington. The first episode we did on this channel 2 years ago was on George Washington. We covered his entire life, and we talked about it from when he was a little boy all the way up through, and when he was a British general in the French and Indian War, and then, of course, became the commander of the Continental Army and took us all the way through the Revolution to help us get our independence, and became our first president. One thing we didn't do in that episode was we did not focus very much on his presidency. And it actually doesn't get much run anywhere in history. If you really look at it, his presidency is not talked about very much. And so we want to rectify that tonight. We want to talk about George Washington's 2 terms in office, why he didn't run for a 3rd term, why he didn't want to be king. He really didn't want to be president in the first place. He got talked into it by John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. He knew that the country needed him to be there for stability and to help form the new government and to move forward as a nation. So he agreed to do it out of honor and out of duty, but really it wasn't his calling. He didn't think he was a politician. So really interesting man, as you know, most consequential American who ever lived, even to this day, the most respected American who ever lived all around the globe. People at the time that he won the revolution and became our president all over the world were naming their sons George after George Washington. So he really was that kind of figure in American and in world history. So today we're going to take on his 2 presidencies, and then we have a special treat for you. We're going to go through 25 interesting facts about George Washington, many of which you probably didn't know. So that'll be a lot of fun too. Let's go ahead and get into it. So this is George Washington, his presidency, and 25 interesting facts. Of course, George Washington was born in 1732, died in 1799 at 67 years old. Many people think that there was actually medical malpractice that was done on him at the end of his life, that he probably could have lived much longer. And we'll talk some about that in one of our slides later in the program. But you see some great pictures here. One to the left when Washington became president right after his inauguration. A really great picture there to the bottom left of him commemorating one of the American July 4ths as commander. The great Betsy Ross flag there in the middle that he helped commission. Of course, his face there in South Dakota on Mount Rushmore, one of the 4 presidents that was depicted there in that incredible project done in South Dakota. The famous fable of the cherry tree, where he chopped down the cherry tree and then admitted it to his father and got admonished, was actually just part of myth, and we'll talk about that. His iconic signature, G. Washington, which he put everywhere on every important document in our history. And then, of course, a picture of himself and the other great founders. Of course, he was the leader of the founders, but really felt like these gentlemen were his brother in what was an incredible experiment, which was a government for we the people. So George Washington and his first inauguration as first president of the United States was held on Thursday, April 30th, 1789, on the balcony of the Federal Hall in New York City. So isn't that interesting that back then our capital was New York City and he actually did it at Federal Hall. The inauguration was held nearly 2 months after the beginning of his first 4-year term as president. And so it took him 2 months to get together the entire congregation to come up and be part of this inauguration ceremony. The Chancellor of New York, Robert Livingston, actually administered the presidential oath in office. And he did it when he put his hand on the Bible. And of course, we have actually administered the oath to every president since with hand on the Bible, since this tradition that Washington started. With his inauguration, the executive branch of the United States government officially began operations under the new frame of government established by the 1787 Constitution. So really interesting that Constitution finally kicked off with this action. The inauguration of John Adams, his vice president, was actually held 9 days earlier on April 21st, 1789. So isn't that interesting that the vice president was actually sworn in before the president was? He assumed his duties as presiding officer of the United States Senate. So one of the reasons that he was sworn in a couple days earlier was so that he could go be president of the Senate. These two inaugurations remain the only scheduled inaugurations to take place on a day that was not either in January or March. So after this presidency and after this administration, all inaugurations since have either been held in March, which happened for about 100 years, and then, of course, recently in January 20th. So interesting that these two inaugurations were held in April. So George Washington's first term accomplishments. Let's take a look at his first term as president. He established a strong federal government by creating the cabinet and the Supreme Court through the Judiciary Act of 1789. He also set crucial precedents for the presidency, such as delivering the first State of the Union address, which of course we still do every year since. He established a neutral foreign policy for the United States to stay out of European wars. And this was very popular with most in America at the time because we had just been through a tremendous war with Britain, and we wanted to remain neutral between Britain and France and Spain and Portugal. His administration saw the creation of the first Bank of the United States. They established a national currency, the dollar, and they also suppressed the Whiskey Rebellion. And he was the only president at the time and since who actually was a sitting president who rode his men into battle. He actually rode and presided over the crushing of the Whiskey Rebellion. It's a really interesting fact there. He also was part of the administration of passing the Judiciary Act. He also led the Congress to pass, and then he signed the Coinage Act of 1792, which created the United States Mint and established the dollar as the official currency. He issued the 1793 Proclamation of Neutrality and then communicated that all around the world so that everybody was aware that the United States was going to stay out of all European wars going forward. His administration directed the war to be led that the United States established control of the Northwest Territory from the British. So that's one of the reasons, of course, that the state of Washington is named after George Washington, because the Northwest Territory was claimed during his administration, his first term. He also helped pass the Naturalization Act of 1790 that established the first federal rules for granting citizenship. The Residence Act of 1790, the act determined that the nation's permanent capital would be located along the Potomac River, which would become Washington, D.C., of course, named after him. Also, the Copyright Act of 1790, this act created the first federal copyright law to protect authors' rights and encourage learning. So really interesting. If you think about you're forming a new government and you have literally no laws in place, they were very busy that first term passing these really key and critical laws to establish a framework for how the country was going to be governed. So really a consequential first term, if you can look at it that way. Many people don't talk about it, but you can see there was a lot accomplished between him and the first Congress. In terms of his key cabinet members in that first administration, these members were people he was very familiar with, of course, because he had gone to war with them and helped lead a revolution with them. First one was Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State and led all of our foreign affairs and other negotiations with foreign powers. Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury and led the process of establishing the federal bank and the dollar. Henry Knox was our Secretary of War. He led all defense and war activities for the country. And then Edmund Randolph was the first Attorney General and, of course, led our Department of Justice. These individuals played crucial roles in shaping the new nation's government. Though their differing political philosophies, particularly between Hamilton and Jefferson, led to the formation of the first party system. And, of course, just a little reminder of what that dispute was about, the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. The Hamiltonians believed very much in federalism. They believed that the federal government and federal power should be much stronger than the states, and that a really strong central government was absolutely crucial and critical to the United States becoming the country that they thought it could be. Whereas Jefferson and the states' rightsers felt just the opposite, that a central government should be focused on just a couple of very small activities, like military, post office, and a couple of other things, but mainly being a government that was not very strong and that could not impose anarchy on the people. And the states' righters wanted to keep most of the power in the state capitals. So this really led to the first party system, something that Washington really was not happy about. And he made it very clear he didn't like that. He wanted us to stay unified. Vice President John Adams would meet with the cabinet, sometimes with Washington's and sometimes separately, and sometimes Washington would meet with them separately. So it's really interesting that Adams was a major player, in some ways was acting kind of like the prime minister of the United States, and would meet with the cabinet quite often, sometimes more than Washington did. So those are the prominent men that were helping Washington and Adams piece this new government together. In George Washington's second term, some of his accomplishments. His second term saw the establishment of the U.S. Navy via the Naval Act of 1794, the peaceful resolution of conflicts with Great Britain through the Jay Treaty that John Jay negotiated, and also a treaty with Spain called the Pinckney Treaty that resolved any conflicts with Spain as well, including some maritime conflicts. Also, the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion that we mentioned that actually straddled the first and second administrations. And so Whiskey Rebellion was something that popped up and had to be subdued. Some of the key domestic actions that happened in the second term included passing of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This was the first act the United States took to try to curb the slave trade itself, and it prohibited U.S. ships from participating in the Atlantic slave trade altogether. And really the goal of it was to try to curb and reduce and try to eventually choke off the slave trade coming from Africa. Also passed the Naturalization Act of 1795, which established the requirements for immigrants to become citizens, including a 5-year residency period requirement, and also maintaining neutrality in foreign conflicts. So there's two things immigrants back then had to do when they came through Ellis Island or another place, was they had to be here at least 5 years, and then they also had to remain neutral when it came to supporting foreign conflicts. If they did those two things, they could become citizen. Almost more importantly, in his second term, 5 states were added. And this is really incredible if you think about it. North Carolina in 1789, Rhode Island in 1790, Vermont in 1791, Kentucky in 1792, and then Tennessee, the 18th state. So we went from 13 to 18 during these two administrations. And Tennessee was in 1796. So these states joined the Union after the original 13 states had ratified the Constitution, which began during Washington's time in office. And you can see a map there to the right of what the country looked like when Washington left his second term, and how much larger the country had gotten, with many different new territories and states being added. So the growth of the United States had begun. So George Washington's presidential residences, it wasn't as simple back then because there was no White House. And so he began his first term in New York City. As you heard before, he had his inauguration there, and he lived in a new home in 3 Cherry Street in New York City. And it must have seemed like the center of the universe, although geographically speaking, it was not even the center of New York City. It was located uptown, but it was facing the East River. And it was only a couple long blocks away from the countryside. So he was essentially right on the edge of New York at 3 Cherry Street. So he lived there really at the beginning of his first administration. During that time, they were also laying the cornerstone of the White House. So in 1792, the cornerstone was laid at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue under the guidance of architect James Hoban. And it would not be completed during George Washington's presidency, of course, so he was never able to live in the White House in his city. His successor, John Adams, would become the first president to reside in the White House. And what's interesting is all the major founders made a point of going there to that ceremony where they laid that first block at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They all knew how important it was for this White House and for this executive branch to be successful. And so you had Washington there, and you had Franklin there, and you had Jefferson, and you had Adams, and all the major players in the formation of the country were there at that ceremony to lay the first cornerstone. Finally, as George Washington's presidency continued on, there was a move of the capital from New York City to Philadelphia. They found that it was much easier to administer the government from there for a bunch of different reasons. So he followed the government and moved his residence to Philadelphia in late 1790, and Washington resided on Market Street for the remainder of his presidency through the rest of his first and second term. It's really interesting that he was there for that move to Philadelphia, which of course was a temporary capital for the United States until the White House and Washington, D.C. were ready. Gives you a little background on where he lived during the presidency. So how was Washington, D.C. and the location chosen right on the Potomac? So Washington, D.C.'s location was chosen through a compromise in 1790 between northern and southern states that led to the Residence Act that we talked about earlier. The act gave President George Washington the authority to select the final spot on the Potomac River, which was ceded by Maryland and Virginia, to create a new independent federal district that was not part of any state. The location was chosen to be centrally located between North and South as a compromise and to create a capital free from state influence. The selection was part of a deal between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, where Southern states agreed to let the federal government assume the Revolutionary War debts to the federal government in exchange for locating the capital closer to the South. And you can see a great map there, right on the Potomac River, of what the original plots of the Washington, D.C. downtown looked like. And Washington was very much a part of this process of drawing out the original streets, along with L'Enfant, who was the designer. And he was very much part of this because, of course, prior to war and the presidency, he was actually a surveyor. So George Washington's decision to not run for a third term, what was interesting is Washington was hesitant to be president in the first place. He felt like he was not a natural politician, but he was talked into running for president the first time by putting his name up by John Adams and James Madison, who talked to him incessantly for weeks that he must be the president because he was the face of the United States. He was also hesitant to run for a second term after his first term was over, but again was talked into staying in place and trying to stabilize the new government. What's interesting is for the second term, he was actually talked into it by Thomas Jefferson, who told him that he really needed to stay one more term so that the government could really solidify. So then George Washington declined to run for his third term in 1796, and it was for a multitude of reasons. He had a desire to not appear ambitious. He liked the image that he was giving to the rest of the world, that he did not want to be king, and he thought that was an excellent image for the United States, who had essentially gone for their revolution against the king because they didn't want a king. So he thought it was very important that he showed that you can step down from power and go back to your farm and be okay. He also believed that the new government after 2 terms was stable enough to sustain itself. And he was longing for retirement to his beloved Mount Vernon. That's where he wanted to be. And so he very much wanted to retire, and so he went ahead and did it. His decision set a precedent that the president would only serve 2 terms throughout our entire history, a practice that lasted all the way until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who broke it by running for a 3rd and a 4th term. Washington's choice was also influenced by his health and the political divisiveness he saw developing. He really was not liking this new party system that Hamilton and Jefferson had formed. He really wanted there to be no parties and for us to be a united country. He actually addressed this in his farewell address, which he addressed a lot of different things in it, but the main thing he talked about was to hold the country together and to stop all the divisiveness and stop all the party backbiting and to come together and to find ways to work together. So it was very much a unifying speech, the farewell address that he did. World leaders were shocked that he did not want to be king, and it sent reverberations all over the world, and it created a number of revolution movements against monarchies. So it was really kind of a shockwave or a shot across the bow to all the monarchies of the world that George Washington was stepping down after 8 years and going back to his farm and handing power over. That had never been considered before. Pretty remarkable. You see a picture there of what his farewell address looked like, and you can actually read it online. It's actually an excellent speech. So George Washington and the Betsy Ross flag. The Betsy Ross flag was a 1792 design for the flag of the United States that first appeared in a painting of George Washington at Trenton by John Trumbull. This flag had red stripes outermost and stars arranged in a circle. The name, first used more than 100 years after the flag appeared in the painting, stems from a legend that a Philadelphia upholsterer, Elizabeth Betsy Ross, designed and produced the flag. The design of the Betsy Ross flag conformed to the Flag Act of 1777, passed early in the American Revolutionary War, which merely specified 13 alternating red and white horizontal stripes to represent the 13 colonies, and white stars in a blue canton. And you can see it there, what the Betsy Ross flag looked like. Betsy Ross, who was an upholsterer from Philadelphia who produced uniforms, tents, and flags for the Continental Forces. Although her manufacturing contributions are documented, a popular legend involved in which Ross was hired by a group of the founding fathers, including George Washington, to make a new U.S. flag, along with the specifications from the Flag Act. According to legend, she deviated from the 6-pointed stars in the design and produced a flag with 5-pointed stars instead. And you can see that's what we still have today, are the 5-pointed stars on our flag. George Washington was a member of the Masonic Lodge. Of course, everyone knows he was a Mason, along with several of the other important founders. And their use of 6-pointed stars as part of Mason imagery may have influenced his choice of 6-pointed stars for his headquarters flag. So it's interesting that everywhere Washington went, if he put up a flag about himself or his group, he always had 6-pointed stars, and he recommended that to Betsy, but she went with the 5-pointed ones. Very interesting fact there. So George Washington's legacy after the presidency, the most prominent and dominating feature of Washington, D.C. skyline is the 555-foot obelisk known as the Washington Monument. You can see it there. You can actually go up to the top of it if you ever would like a real challenging climb. While there are statues of George Washington in traffic circles and other nooks and crannies all over the nation's capital, most Americans, and for that matter, foreigners, look at Washington with the towering obelisk as the symbol of Washington, D.C., and the symbol of America. On first glance, it may seem odd that America's foremost founder would simply have an obelisk dedicated to his memory. But the obelisk is symbolic of the Egyptian sun god Ra, the giver of light and life. While Washington may not have had any children of his own, he was fittingly called the father of the United States for many reasons. Biographer Thomas Flexner called Washington the indispensable man of the Revolution. And historian Joseph Ellis argued that Washington was the glue that held the nation together. And it really was true. He was the only man that could have both led the Continental Army and then became president and helped this fledgling nation become a real country. So this holding the nation together was a reference not only to his military leadership during the War of Independence, but also for his political leadership at the Constitutional Convention and his moral leadership as first president of the United States. Though well-read, as an intellectual, Washington did not share the same company with Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson or even James Madison. In other words, they were the intellectuals and he was more the leadership type. His leadership skills were peerless in this group. Abigail Adams, an ever-astute judge of character, called him the most important American who ever lived, and that was over her own husband at the time. George Washington was at the forefront of every major event of American history from 1754 to 1799, and now, of course, has his name on our capital and a state out west, which is the state of Washington. It's pretty amazing as a legacy he had. Even at the time, his peers were saying he was the most important American by far. George Washington's image to the rest of the world, before the presidents, before Hollywood, even before Elvis, there was George Washington. He was the world superstar. The United States was a disunited smear of colonies along the East Coast of a mighty landmass when men from cities, farms, hillsides, and swamps gathered under George Washington to fight off foreign rule. In other words, before we were united, he united us. There was a Continental Congress, and sure, there was leadership from men like John Adams of Boston and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, but both men would go on to be presidents just like Washington, but neither man led troops into battle, and neither man had charisma to galvanize this disparate lot of colonists to lead an unlikely army of poorly trained provincials with bad equipment to victory over the mightiest army on earth. Only George Washington did that. People wanted Washington in power. Many people needed Washington in power to have confidence in this newly formed government that literally was coming out of nothing. The early federal government was a vague, faceless mass of unknowable components. George Washington was the first face of the revolution. He was a respected leader and a man many of the new Americans trusted. He was also the only man in America that Europeans respected. They had watched him take on the British Army and beat it at the greatest upset in world history. His name carried a weight that no American has ever carried since. People all over the world named their sons George, not after King George, but after Washington. So pretty incredible if you think about the image not only did he have across America to unite us, but the image he had all over the world and how much they respected him, how much they respected the fact that he did not want to be king. And he wanted to uphold why we fought the revolution in the first place. George Washington on the money. The face of George Washington has appeared on the US $1 bill since 1869. So basically just after the Civil War was over. The current design, featuring the Great Seal on the reverse, has remained unchanged since 1963. It's the most widely circulated US currency, and there are no plans to change its design as of now. Washington's portrait has also appeared on the $2 silver certificate in 1899, but that note is no longer in circulation and has now been replaced by the portrait of Thomas Jefferson that's on the modern $2 bill. Washington's profile has also graced the front of the US 25 cent or the quarter since 1832, first issued to commemorate the 200th anniversary of his birth in 1732. There's also a Washington $1 coin that was minted as part of the presidential $1 coin program, which features all the deceased US presidents. These coins are primarily for collectors and are not widely circulated. George Washington's image was chosen for prominent currency due to his role as the first US president, commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and the key founding father, making him a universally recognized and respected figure in American history. So you can imagine the people that you want on your money have to be the most respected and the most recognized for people to really take the money seriously. You see a picture there of the modern $1 bill that he's been on for all those years, the $1 coin that you can get as a collector, and then, of course, the quarter that's still in circulation and has been there for many, many years. So that gives you a really good sense for Washington, his first term, his second term, what his accomplishments were, some of the background of his presidency, his cabinet, all the different things he had to face for this new country, this new government that was just spinning up. You can imagine when you're starting from scratch how difficult that was. And it really took him all 8 years to get the government really where he wanted it and where he felt comfortable to go into retirement. Let's go ahead and take a look at a short video. We'll come back and talk about it. And then after that, we'll talk about the 25 interesting facts about George Washington.
The first president of the United States, George Washington, is more well known for his Revolutionary War service than anything he actually did as president. However, his 8-year presidency was perhaps just as important to ensuring America's survival. Washington had already gone a long way towards saving the nation simply by taking on the responsibility of being president. In the years that followed the Revolution, America had become fractured, weak, and unstable. France fully expected America's collapse and was already making plans on how to take advantage of the situation. Great Britain was hoping to regain their colonies, at least in some capacity. The lack of any strong central leadership meant that the individual states were tearing the nation apart. As different states and regions of the country were out for their own interest, rivalries only grew more bitter. Without a strong leader, no authority could ensure the states would work together rather than compete with each other. And it wasn't just a matter of having anyone as president. Electing the wrong person could have fractured the nation even more. Despite fierce divisions, everyone agreed that George Washington was the man for the job. Washington didn't want to serve. He only did so for the good of the country, and only after countless requests. And in doing so, he bought the infantile America more time. But if he didn't make the right decisions, it could still collapse. Many were still confident that the United States only had one more year at best. It was all on Washington to not only save the nation, but also ensure its long-term survival, and to do so in a way that aligned with its founding principles, so that it wouldn't devolve into tyranny. No issue was more pressing than the debt. The nation had accumulated massive amounts of debt during the Revolutionary War and was essentially bankrupt. The larger issue, however, was to come up with a plan to make sure the states actually paid off their debt rather than dodging the issue, something the Continental Congress had failed to do. Washington promoted a plan proposed by his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, which entailed the federal government taking on all of the states' debts and paying them off through taxes. The issue, however, was controversial with another member of Washington's cabinet, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson feared a strong federal government and saw the power to assume states' debts as a step in that direction. Furthermore, some southern states had already paid off much of their debts. Thus, Hamilton's plan would initially favor the North. However, Jefferson worked out a compromise with Hamilton, leading to the plan becoming law. One of the other major issues over the course of Washington's presidency was establishing America's place on the international stage. Washington's policy towards foreign conflicts became one of neutrality. This was his way of dealing with the French Revolution. His stance was controversial, as many Americans supported aiding the revolution. The French Revolution started in the first months of Washington's presidency. Generally speaking, Americans saw this as a sister revolution to their own. An oppressed population was fighting against a monarchical government in favor of a more republican one. However, as the years passed, the revolution raged on and became increasingly radical through major social changes and ever-escalating violence. Over time, many Americans became more and more weary of it. Washington had been skeptical of the revolution and only became more so with time. He feared that endorsing the French in any way would mean inviting those same radical sentiments to the United States, which he believed could destroy the nation. In 1793, early in his second term, he issued a proclamation of neutrality, which declared the United States wouldn't take the side of France or the side of its neighbors. Furthermore, he put down the activities of French Ambassador Edmond Charles Genet. Genet had been trying to rally Americans against the Washington administration and in support of France. The other motivation for neutrality was to improve relations with Great Britain. Siding with the French would mean inevitable war with Britain. America was still fragile, and perhaps the last thing it could afford was another war. The British were already accusing the United States of aiding the French, and in 1793 began confiscating United States ships trading with France. Furthermore, relations between the two countries were still strained from America's Revolutionary War. The British were still carrying out impressment of American sailors, capturing sailors and forcing them to work on British ships. They were still preventing the United States from participating in the profitable West Indian trade, and they still occupied forts on the United States' Western Front, despite having agreed to abandon them. Between 1794 and 1795, Washington oversaw the writing and ratification of the Jay Treaty to resolve many of these issues and avoid war with Great Britain for the time being. Washington might have averted war, but in doing so, he spurred on the political war within the nation. Thomas Jefferson and his followers disliked Washington's neutrality in regards to France. They saw the French Revolution as a natural extension of the American Revolution, and even though Jefferson eventually turned against the French due to the extreme violence of the Reign of Terror, his underlying sentiments remained. Hamilton, on the other hand, saw the French Revolution as something else entirely. believing that at its core it didn't represent the ideals represented by the American Revolution. This division between Thomas Jefferson and his followers and Alexander Hamilton and his didn't just start with the French Revolution. It had been brewing for years, and the French Revolution just further defined it. Generally speaking, Hamilton represented the interest of people living in the cities who believed America needed a strong central government, whereas Jefferson represented agrarian interest and strongly supported a decentralized government. Washington was well aware of these differences. He'd hoped that by placing both men on his cabinet, he'd engender a spirit of cooperation and promote national unity. Not only did Washington fail in this aim, but he might have exacerbated the issue. During Jefferson's time in the cabinet, he simply grew more and more resentful as he watched Washington repeatedly favor Hamilton's ideas, whether it be dealing with the debt or with the French Revolution. To Jefferson, Washington's calls for unity were just calls for Jefferson and his Republicans to submit. By the start of Washington's second term, the two parties that would dominate American politics for the next 2 decades were already forming, something Washington greatly lamented. There were many other issues during the Washington presidency. He oversaw the creation of the capital as Washington, D.C. When Washington took office, he resided in New York City. The city was simply the temporary capital until a permanent capital could be decided upon. Once again, this was a controversial issue, as Southerners and Northerners both wanted the capital to be in their respective regions. Eventually, Jefferson and Hamilton decided to place the capital in Maryland as a compromise, as it was between North and South. George Washington then chose the exact site for the new city and appointed the architect who was to come up with a bold and modern design for it. While the city was under construction, Washington moved to Philadelphia, which had become the nation's new temporary capital from 1790 to 1800. George Washington oversaw the construction of Washington, D.C., but never actually lived there, let alone lived in the White House. The White House was only completed in 1800, 3 years after Washington's presidency ended and a year after his death. Washington was also the first president to deal with a rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion broke out in response to Hamilton's new taxing plan, which placed a heavy tax on whiskey, which hurt Americans in western Pennsylvania. The rebellion lasted for 3 years and ended when George Washington personally led troops in the field to put the rebellion down in 1794, the second year of his second term. For the most part, Washington was able to put the rebellion down without violence. By the time he arrived, most of the rebels had dispersed. There were only 170 arrests made and 2 convictions, though Washington pardoned both men. One of Washington's highest priorities was to come up with a Native American policy. He used both diplomacy and aggression, depending on the situation. Upset that so little progress had been made in expanding into the Northwest Territories, he commissioned an army to subdue the native forces. However, in the South, relations with the tribes were more diplomatic. Washington made a treaty in which the native lands would be protected under the condition that they began to move from a hunting culture to a farming one, in the hopes of eventually assimilating them into European culture. Initially, Washington and his Secretary of War Henry Knox were optimistic, as were many of the natives themselves. However, it wasn't long before swarms of American settlers were pushing into protected tribal territory with no regard for the treaty. Because of the conflicts with the natives in the Northwest, Congress finally recognized the need for a well-trained standing army. Despite their strong reservations and fears of how such an army could be misused, Washington had proposed a standing army all the way back in 1783. As president, he oversaw the creation of the Legion of the United States, the nation's first standing army. Washington also oversaw the birth of the Supreme Court. When he came into office, the Supreme Court was empty. Thus, Washington nominated a justice for every seat. He is the only president with this distinction. Perhaps what Washington's presidency is most commonly known for is setting precedent. Very little of the precedent Washington set was incidental. He was conscious of the fact that everything he did and the way he did it would set the standard for presidents going forward. Everything from the way he regulated state versus federal problems, where he exercised his power versus where he exercised restraint, and simply how he conducted himself around everyone, from formal guests to common people in the streets, was done deliberately. Generally speaking, Washington tried to carry himself in a way that commanded respect and dignity, as he believed it was essential that people have a high degree of respect for the office of president. In dealing with Congress, he had to balance not being tyrannical with being firm and making sure Congress had a clear understanding of the power of the presidency. In all of his time in office, he only exercised his veto power twice. In part, he did this to set the precedent that a president wasn't supposed to be constantly butting heads with Congress. However, he also established boundaries. When angry Jeffersonians in the House demanded Washington provide Congress with all papers related to the Jay Treaty, Washington simply refused. He also set a standard for cabinet interactions. It was established in the Constitution that a president would have a cabinet, but the details of how the president would use it weren't specified. Washington let his cabinet speak to him freely, debate with each other, and he accepted their advice. But it was by no means a parliamentary system. Washington ultimately had the final say. In dealing with the Whiskey Rebellion, he established a role for the federal government in employing force to manage conflicts with citizens and states. However, he also demonstrated a balanced approach by suppressing the rebellion without resorting to tyranny. Overall, Washington's actions defined the presidential role as more than just a figurehead, but also not a tyrant. The president was to be a decisive executive who used the Constitution to guide his actions. Though Washington is almost always considered one of the greatest, if not the single greatest president of the United States, his presidency has been criticized. Notably, he's been criticized for his inaction on the slavery issue. Some even criticize him more than other presidents, saying that with his beloved status, he, more than anyone else, could have done something about slavery. And in doing so, he may have even helped the nation avoid the Civil War, which took place 64 years after he left office. Washington had deliberately avoided discussing slavery in public. Privately, he expressed his wish to one day free his slaves and his hope for nationwide, gradual emancipation. However, he was also aware of just how bitter the issue was, and considering the fragile condition of the nation, he believed even taking a public stance on slavery might tear the nation apart. Another criticism was his reliance on Alexander Hamilton, or as some might say, over-reliance. Many claim Washington relied on Hamilton's judgment far too often rather than coming to his own conclusions. Some argue that this reliance on Hamilton was simply representative of Washington's tenure as president, that he was important as a symbolic figure, but that other figures were much more important in the actual mechanics of his presidency. Historian Forrest McDonald wrote in his biography of Washington, quote, "George Washington was indispensable, but only for what he was, not for what he did. He was the symbol of the presidency, the epitome of propriety in government, the means by which Americans accommodated the change from monarchy to republicanism." However, he stated that Washington, quote, "had done little in his own right, and had in fact often, quote, opposed the best measures of his subordinates." By contrast, professor of history and author Stephen Knott said that Washington, quote, almost single-handedly created a new government, shaping its institutions, offices, and political practices. Washington's profound achievements built the foundations of a powerful national government that has survived for more than 2 centuries. Writer and biographer Ron Chernow describes the same sentiment in more detail. Quote, "He had restored American credit and assumed state debt, created a bank, a mint, a coast guard, a customs service, and a diplomatic corps, introduced the first accounting, tax, and budgetary procedures, maintained peace at home and abroad, inaugurated a navy, bolstered the army, and shored up coastal defenses and infrastructure, proved that the country could regulate commerce and negotiate binding treaties, protected frontier settlers, subdued Indian uprisings, and established law and order amid rebellion, scrupulously adhering all the while to the letter of the Constitution. Most of all, he had shown a disbelieving world that Republican government could prosper without being spineless or disorderly or reverting to authoritarian rule."
So as you can see from that video, many things to discuss. The first one is France and England both very much believed that the United States was going to collapse, that essentially the revolution had been successful, but that the following government was not going to be successful with this new Republican idea. And Washington and the other founders who crafted this government through his first 2 terms proved all of them wrong. Not only was it successful, but it ended up becoming the most successful form of government that humans have ever put in place. And so really, if you think about just that legacy alone, the fact that Washington was able to win independence, but then able to win the peace afterwards with his cabinet and with the other part of his government. So really pretty incredible there if you think about it, that France and England were ready to come pick up the pieces and never were able to because the United States was successful. Secondly, if you saw some of the accomplishments he had during his presidency, if you think about, again, the fact that he was starting with nothing and they were establishing every bit of our federal government from scratch with an idea, and the fact that they were able to put all those things into place in a successful way that it still sustains even 250 years later today, is pretty remarkable, and that those institutions have been able to survive and be intact. And also you see how much he was beloved by the people, that he could have stayed forever if he wanted to. He really could have. But he decided that he wanted to set that precedent, that we were a Republican government, not a monarchy. And it was really important to him to show that, and that he was going to step down and go into retirement as he originally had promised. You can see there were some criticisms of him during his presidency. There were some things that lauded him during his presidency and all his different accomplishments, of which there were many. But in the end, he was the symbol of the American Revolution. He was the symbol of America. He was the symbol of the government and the foundation of our new framework that we enjoy today. So really the most consequential American. And I believe if he wasn't the greatest president, he was definitely in the top 5 because he was given nothing as a pattern to follow. He essentially was starting from scratch. So let's go ahead and take a look at 25 interesting facts about George Washington. All right, number 1 interesting fact was George Washington didn't have a middle name. With a name like George Washington, you didn't really need a middle name, as you can imagine, but wasn't it interesting that George Washington didn't have a middle name? You can see his famous signature there to the right. Actually, relatively common back then. About 40% of men in the Americas at that time did not have a middle name. So not that unusual that he didn't. Interesting fact number 2 about George Washington, his birthday was not February 22nd, although many people celebrate it as part of President's Day on February 22nd. That was not actually his birthday. His birthday he was actually born on was February 11th, 1732. But when the colonies switched to the Gregorian calendar from the Julian calendar, which happened during his lifetime, his birthday was moved 11 days from February 11th to February 22nd because of that switch from the Julian calendar to Gregorian. It's really interesting that he died with a different birthday than he was born with. February 11th versus the 22nd. Other interesting fact number 3, George Washington's hair was all real, unlike most of the other founders who wore wigs not just for fashion, but wore it because they were losing their hair or in some cases had completely lost their hair. Washington always kept his hair all real and really preferred not to wear wigs. He complained to his aides many times the wigs were very hot and very scratchy. And so you can see in both of these pictures He always stayed with his own hair throughout his life, even into old age. Interesting fact 4, George Washington was made an honorary citizen of France. The quintessential American received this honor in 1792 because of his valor and heroism in fighting England. And of course, England was France's huge rival and enemy throughout their history. And so they made Washington an honorary citizen of France. Very interesting. You can see some great photos there. And the one in the middle was a painting that was done by a French artist about His Excellency George Washington. And then on the right there is a great photo of the American and the French flag together. So number 5, George Washington was named non-president commander-in-chief, but he didn't do very much. It was really an honorary title. In 1798, after he left the presidency and John Adams was president, when fears were growing of a French invasion of the country, Washington was named by John Adams commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, even though he wasn't president anymore. So isn't that interesting that John essentially gave him that title during his presidency? And he just was a ceremonial commander-in-chief, ideally to try to prevent the French invasion, which he did. It's really interesting. His name carried that much weight around the world. Number 6, no one will ever rank higher than him in the U.S. military. In 1976, this isn't that long ago, Washington was posthumously awarded the highest rank in the U.S. military. No one will ever outrank him. He's called General of the Armies of the United States, which is higher than any of the star generals. So isn't that fascinating? You see some great pictures there, one of him on his horse and one of him dismounted in his different military garb that he wore all throughout the pre- and post-revolution days. See the great flag there from Betsy Ross. And how fascinating is it that he will always be the top general in our history. Number 7, George Washington made a pretty hefty salary at the time. In 1789, Washington's presidential salary was 2% of the entire U.S. budget. Can you imagine? One salary. George Washington was paid nearly $25,000 a year when he was president. This salary was set by the first Congress in 1789 and remained the standard for presidential pay for over 75 years. So he was paid 2% of the total budget, $25,000 a year. Pretty incredible. Number 8, but he still had cash flow problems even though he was paid so much. Washington actually had to borrow money to attend his first inauguration. He was able to build up wealth after his presidency, however, and when he died, he was one of the wealthiest Americans, with most of his net worth in land. Estimated in today's money would be about $600 million would be his estate when he died. He never had much cash, however. Washington owned over 50,000 acres of land, including his 8,000-acre Mount Vernon estate. You see that beautiful estate there in the center. If you haven't had a chance to go visit it, it really is worth the time. Go on a visit of Mount Vernon. You'll learn a lot. Number 9, he was one of the sickliest presidents in history. He had many different afflictions throughout his life, including his presidency. He suffered from a laundry list of ailments like diphtheria and tuberculosis, smallpox, dysentery, malaria, quinsy, which was kind of like our tonsillitis, carbuncle, pneumonia, and epiglottis. And those are just a few of the things he had during his lifetime. So you can imagine, especially when he became a prominent American, he always had a medical detail that came with him, even in battles, because he had so many different afflictions. Number 10, he may or may not have died as a result of medical malpractice. Back then, they believed that bloodletting was a good thing. On the day he died, December 14, 1799, Washington was treated with 4 rounds of bloodletting, which removed 5 pints of blood from his body. They now believe that that probably is what killed him. If they had just not done the bloodletting, he probably would have recovered and lived a much longer life. So very sad that they really misunderstood medicine back then and did the bloodletting thinking it was a good thing and would get the disease out of him. And in fact, it probably killed him. Number 11, George Washington was believed to have been infertile. Washington had no children of his own. In 2007, John K. Amory of the University of Washington School of Medicine proposed that Washington was infertile, and he wrote an article, all the reasons why he thought so, and some of the evidence that he thought. It's really interesting to think about that. Why did Washington never have kids, although he was married almost his entire adult life? See some great photos there of him. Number 12, Washington's body was almost buried in the capital of the United States. Washington requested that he be buried at Mount Vernon with his wife, which he is today, and his family upheld that request despite repeated pleas from Congress. They wanted to put his body underneath a marble statue in the Capitol to be there forever. So interesting that they had a battle over Washington's body after he died and where he was going to be laid to rest. Finally, his family won. And today, if you visit Mount Vernon, you can go see his tomb along with his wife. Number 13, he was God-fearing but not very religious. As Edward Lengel, writer of the George Washington biography, Inventing George Washington, told NPR in 2011, he was a very moral man. He was very righteous and virtuous. And he watched carefully everything that he did. But he certainly didn't fit into the conception of a Christian evangelical that we have today, or somebody who read his Bible every day. He did live by a particularly Christian theology. And as you know, and we talked about earlier in the program, he did actually swear in at the inauguration with his hand on a Bible. So he very much believed in God and believed in everything about Christianity and all the moral teachings coming out of it. But he was not a daily practicing Christian, I would say. Number 14, he never chopped down that cherry tree. Isn't it interesting? We're always taught that old fable. And you can see the book to the right there called The 4th of July. This is a very popular kids' book after his life was over during the early formation of America. It was called 4th of July, and it talked about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. And then because he was so honest, he told his father what he had done and took his punishment. What happened, though, was this was a total myth created by writers at the time to familiarize George's youth as his rise continued in the early Americas. They wanted to familiarize him and personalize him. And this really never happened. There's no evidence that the cherry tree ever happened, that it truly was a fable. Number 15, he was a voracious letter writer. We don't have the exact number, but the best estimates seem to put the number of letters he penned somewhere between 18 and 20,000. And if you wrote one letter a day, it would take you between 50 and 55 years to write that many letters. So you can imagine he was writing at least one a day, sometimes two a day, throughout much of his adult life. And that's the way you corresponded back then. Without the internet, without phones, no other way to communicate. You sent letters. You can see some great examples of what his writing actually looked like. That's his handwriting in both cases. And he would write these long letters sitting at his desk in Mount Vernon or in the Capitol, and then send them off to whoever he was corresponding with. That was the way they communicated. Number 16, before becoming the father of the nation, he was a master surveyor. We talked about this was his profession before he was a general and a president. He spent the early part of his career as a professional surveyor. Over the course of his life, Washington created some 199 different land surveys, including Alexandria, Virginia, and many others in the South. Washington took this skill with him into his role as military leader. He used a lot of these field surveying skills when he was a general. You can imagine it would be a really good skill to have. You can see some great pictures there of him surveying different portions of the country. In the one on the left there, he had Native Americans helping him, guide him around the country. And some of the great tools that he used as a surveyor there, those are tools that are actually at Mount Vernon in the museum there, if you want to go take a look. What a fascinating career he had before public service. Number 17, before fighting the British, he fought for the British. At age 21, Washington was sent to lead a British colonial force against the French in Ohio in the French and Indian War. He lost, but gained valuable experience. This conflict helped spark the 7 Years' War in North America. So you can see a great picture of him in the different stages of the French and Indian War when he was a very young officer. And he was getting his first battle action, which really came very much in handy later on in the Revolution. Number 18, he was a dog lover, very prominent dog lover. Washington kept and he bred, and he actually had a breeding farm at Mount Vernon. And his primary breed that he liked to breed and keep was hunting hounds. He is known as the father of the American foxhound. And in Virginia at that time, fox hunting was a big sport. All the men would get on horseback, take their foxing hounds with them, and go chase foxes around the countryside. What was interesting was Washington kept as many as 30 dogs at a time for his personal enjoyment. And he kept those dogs both at the presidential residence, wherever he was, New York, Philadelphia, etc., and also at Mount Vernon. So you can imagine everywhere where he lived, there was 30 dogs running around, mostly of these hunting hound dogs. Number 19, he lost more battles than he won. According to Joseph Ellis, His Excellency and George Washington book, our first president lost more battles than any victorious general in modern history. He won 11 battles in his career and he lost 15. It's really interesting that he lost more than he won, but the key was he kept the American Continental Army together, whether they won or lost. And that was what was the most important to the people. That was the propaganda war that he won, was keeping them together and then winning enough to eventually outlast the British. Number 20, he was lucky, but his coat wasn't. In the Braddock disaster of 1755, Washington's troops were caught in a crossfire between British and Native American soldiers. This was in the French and Indian War. 2 horses were shot from under Washington. He lost 2 horses that day. And his coat was pierced by 4 different musket balls. So he essentially was shot 4 times through his coat. None of them actually hit his body. So how lucky was George Washington to have been shot in one battle 4 different times, and essentially they went through his coat and didn't touch his body. And you can see a couple great pictures there of him in his military uniform at different stages of his career. And then there's a picture of what his coat would have looked like in that battle in the French and Indian War, and what his coat would have looked like that sustained the 4 bullet holes. Fortunately, they didn't hit him. Number 21, he didn't have wooden teeth, as is often talked about in the different literature. He did have false teeth, however. They were made of a variety of materials, including ivory, brass, horse teeth, and even human teeth. So they're really a mix of different things. You can see there's actually one of his set of false teeth there that they have at Mount Vernon, there to the bottom right, and what they used to look like. It's really interesting that there's this myth that he had wooden teeth, and it just wasn't true. Number 22, George Washington is the only president to actually go into battle while serving as president. And we mentioned this a little bit. On September 19th, 1794, Washington became the only sitting president to personally lead troops in the field when he led the militia on a nearly month-long march west over the Allegheny Mountains to the town of Bedford, Pennsylvania. He was headed to crush the Whiskey Rebellion, and he did so. Isn't that amazing that it took him an entire month to march with his troops on horseback all the way to Bedford, Pennsylvania? That's how long it took to travel back then. Number 23, he fell in love with his best friend's wife. According to Joseph Ellis, several letters show that before he married Martha Washington, who was his wife for his life, he was actually in love with Sally Fairfax, who was the wife of George William Fairfax, who his family is named after the Fairfax County in Virginia. In 1758, Washington wrote to Sally his famous Votary to Love letter. And it's actually a very steamy letter that he wrote to Sally Fairfax, who was a married woman. So isn't it interesting? There was this possible scandal brewing. You see a picture there in the middle of him sitting around with Sally Fairfax and other ladies at a social event. This is an affair that never ended up happening, but could have been very scandalous for his career. Number 24, George Washington was widely criticized in the press in the later years of his presidency. He was accused of having an overly monarchical style and was criticized for his declaration of neutrality in overseas conflicts. You saw that in the video, all the criticism he was getting for not supporting the French Revolution and trying to keep America out of that conflict and trying to keep America neutral between France and England. And you can see as that French Revolution wore on and got more and more bloody and more horrific, it was actually a good thing that we stayed out of that revolution, even though it seemed at first like it was very similar to ours. Really, the values that the mob was instilling in their people really was not what we wanted to be part of. And also, it allowed America to trade with and have relations with all the different European countries. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was one of the most critical of Washington, as was John Adams in the press. So it must have been very hurtful to him as these national papers rolled out these men that he had founded the country with and fought for our independence with, and all of a sudden they were incredibly critical of him in the national press. It must have been incredibly hurtful. 25, he owned a whiskey distillery, and you can see a picture of it there in the middle, still at Mount Vernon today. They're still running this distillery, and you can get a bottle of 1797, which is George Washington's whiskey. He installed it at Mount Vernon in 1797, and it was very profitable. According to Julian Nemowitz, a Polish visitor to the estate, it distilled 12,000 gallons a year and sold those gallons. In 1799, 2 years later, Washington wrote to his nephew, 200 gallons of whiskey will be ready this day for your call, and the sooner it is taken, the better, as the demand for this article in these parts is brisk. So you can see business was really good for George Washington whiskey at the time. One of the ways that he built up wealth in his later years. So if you want to get a bottle of 1797, you can order it. Let's take a look at some famous George Washington quotes. The harder the conflict, the greater the triumph. I really like that whole concept. It really is true. The harder it takes to get there, the greater it is when you actually succeed. Be not glad at the misfortune of another, though he may be your enemy. So this really is a Christian tenet, to love your enemy like your friend, and don't be glad at someone's misfortune. Really good advice there. Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder. So he was talking about even in the early Americas, there was already lots of corruption that they were trying to put down. And what he was seeing was many men just couldn't resist the highest bidder. And so he was really cautioning against that whole process and to find a way to be a better person, to not bend under pressure to the highest bidder. It is impossible to govern the world without God. It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of the Almighty God, to obey his will and to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly implore his protection and favor. And this is really what all the founding fathers believed. Most of them were deists and believed very strongly in a strong God, and that we were given God-given rights and principles to found this country. And this is what they really believed. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts, of common dangers and sufferings and successes. So he really believed that the way we pull the country together, the way we got our independence, the way we got our liberty, was a joint effort of struggle against the British and against everyone who was trying to not let the United States succeed. And so he wanted everyone to appreciate the fact that our independence and liberty really comes from all those efforts. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. Again, this was his theory of neutrality. He really believed strongly that the only way the United States was going to be successful was to stay neutral, to stay kind of like the Switzerland at the time, so that we could trade with everybody. Government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is a force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. And so he was warning against, and many of the founding fathers were warning against, a tyrannical government, a government that would get too strong. One of the reasons Jefferson and Hamilton were always arguing was because Hamilton was always trying to make the government stronger and more centralized, and Jefferson was trying to prevent it. And Washington, in a lot of ways, was sitting right in the middle of that argument. Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth. Really cool quote there. If you think about these men put their entire lives, all of their wealth, possible being hung against the British, and they put it all at risk for liberty. And so he's exactly right. When man tastes it, that's what he wants. Guard against the impostors of pretended patriotism. It's a really interesting quote. be careful to make sure you know who the real patriots are versus the fake patriots. I had rather be on my farm than be emperor of the world. What a profound statement by George Washington, and so true. This is a man who didn't even want to be president in the first place, but did it out of duty. Didn't want to run for re-election, and then, of course, didn't his third term run for re-election, and wanted to go back to Mount Vernon and just be a regular citizen. And nobody could understand this around the world, especially the kings of all the major nations, all of whom wanted to be king their entire lives until they died, and then they wanted to pass the power to their son. But that's not the government we were forming here. We were forming a government of the people, by the people. Real men despise battle, but will never run from it. And that really was George Washington. This is a man who put his entire life into the service of the country, in the service of the military, and the service of gaining our independence. And so it is true, you should try to avoid battle at all costs, but there are times where it's not avoidable, and you have to stand up to it. So some really great quotes there from George Washington. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot about George Washington, his presidency, both of his terms, why he didn't run for a third term, why he wanted to return to retirement, how he helped form the government from scratch. Literally, there was nothing there to work with. And he worked with these great founders, and he worked with the Constitutional Convention to build the most important document in human history, which is the Constitution. And how he helped us form the country, was the father of the country, and you see why now in many ways. And then hopefully you learned a lot of interesting things about him in the 25 interesting facts, and that you'll want to dig some more into George Washington. We think we know him, but do we really? There's a lot of aspects of his life that we don't cover very much. And hopefully we got some of that tonight, and that you really enjoyed learning some more about this very important and most important American. Thank you very much for tuning into Traveling Through History. We really appreciate all the great comments you give us. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We've got a lot of great content coming your way. Hopefully you love history as much as we do. And we'll see you on another episode of Traveling Through History. Have a good night.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the state.